As we bring our prayers this day, we bring our prayers in the words of Stan McKay. Cree Man from Manitoba, first Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada. Words that Stan gave us many decades ago that still speak of the 7 sacred teachings of his and so many Indigenous teachings. We offer these words together. We come with thanksgiving for our very breath, the warmth of sun and the sustaining waters, for the life all around us, for plants, soft grasses, and sheltering trees, for the ones that crawl, those that swim, and those that fly, for the 4-legged and the 2-legged, all our relations. We celebrate the diversity in creation as reflected in the 4 winds from the 4 directions. We especially honor the many peoples with their many gifts for understanding our shared life on the earth. We strive to live out the 7 sacred teachings: respect, love, honesty, courage, humility, wisdom, truth. These teachings enable us to live in harmony with ourselves and with our neighbors and with all the created earth. May it be so. Amen. Well, since it's spring break, and since teachers are getting a well-deserved break, I thought it was a good day for us to talk about teachers. We've had many of them in our lives, some that are particularly memorable to us. So I want to invite you to think about a best teacher in your life, and then some of you might tell us who that was and why they were the best teacher you had. A best teacher.
My favorite and best teacher was my grade 6 teacher, Mrs. Dye. She taught out at Knighton Central School out west, and she believed that girls should be allowed to wear pantyhose outside because we had to wear dresses because it was winter and we didn't wear snow pants. So she allowed us to wear nylon stockings outside. That was one thing. I thought that was awesome because we couldn't wait to wear nylons. But the other thing was, in grade 6, they didn't have an award for achievement. So Mrs. Dye gave me $5 out of her pocket and told me that I could do anything I wanted with it. So I went to the big city and spent it at the Edmonton exhibition for the first time in my life. She was a very cool teacher.
Allison, have you had a best teacher?
My best teacher was Mrs. Ellison, and she said happy birthday to us.
Ah, lovely. Other best teachers in your life? Virginia?
My best teacher was Teddy Oakey. I had him in high school for 2 years, and then he was my dissertation supervisor at university. Teddy Oakey was a man who came from a very difficult background. His family were Japanese living on Vancouver Island when the Second World War started, and they were all shipped to southern Alberta to work in the beet fields, including him, after school. So he overcame all of the barriers, was recognized as someone that would be a good teacher by his principal at that time, who arranged for him to go to Calgary to study in Teachers College, but he wasn't allowed to live in Calgary because of the rules of the city at that time, so he had to hitchhike from, I forget the name of that little town just south of Calgary, every day. He challenged us, he encouraged us, and he inspired me.
Another best teacher, Tilda?
There was more than one. Kate Pierce was our English teacher and married to George Ford in the Faculty of Engineering at the university here. Keith Thompson, who taught us to be civil. We addressed him as sir. But my principal, Al Kunst, asked me into his office at the end of grade 12 and asked me what I intended to do. And I said I thought I might go to Calgary and take a lab tech course. And he said, "But you're not very good at math, are you?" And I said, "Oh yeah." So he said, "Well, how about teaching?" And that's what I did, and he was right on, because I love teaching.
So there will be David.
I too had many teachers that were my favorite, but I guess my best one was Miss Purvis in grade 1. And I remember going home for lunch that first day, and I was so excited to tell my mother that the teacher had a little yellow bird. And we had this canary all year in class, and we used to give it a bath. And because it had a little bath, she had a little bathtub that hung on the side of the cage, and I thought that was just the neatest thing. But what was so special about her was she brought me out of my shell. I was really, really shy, and at that age, and so yeah, she was very beneficial to me. Thank you.
We have many teachers in our lives, and perhaps some stories we'll share with each other over lunch about best teachers. But I want to invite us to think about, not all of our teachers taught us in school. Some of our teachers taught us at home. Parents, grandparents, extended family. And not all of our teachers are people. For instance, one of our great teachers looks like this. One of our great teachers is soil, right, Jim? Some of you have spent your lives studying soil, and you know it's a great teacher. Others of you have spent your lives waiting for this time of year and hoping that the last frost is the May long weekend and you can dig your hands into this kind of teacher. I think I learned, I think I learned about some of the lessons of soil in an experience I had of being in a sweat lodge. And for those of you who've had that experience, it's a very intense experience in indigenous ceremonies of song and rattles and story. And as the heat in the sweat lodge becomes very intense and the sounds in the darkness become very intense, it was soil that taught me I was safe. I could put my face down and smell that rich soil and that humus and know that I was all right, I was safe. Soil is one of our great teachers. Another one of our great teachers is over here. We listen to it every week because it is a great teacher. And if we listen to our rivers and we listen to water where we find it in our lives, it has songs to sing of all the places it's been and all the things it's seen. It has stories to tell of all the journeys it's made and what it has gathered up in itself along the way. Water is one of our great teachers. And then find the child within you for a minute and do this with me. Air is also one of our great teachers. We breathe it. We feel it. We know its movement. And it is one of our great teachers in life about that which we cannot see and cannot contain and cannot put our hands around, but we know it all the time. We move through it all the time. Our life depends on it. Air is one of our great teachers. And of course, fire is one of our great teachers. We are always changing, just like fire is always changing. It's like life. We look at it and we think we see it, and then it's different again, and it's different again, and it's different again. We have these teachers all around us, and we also have teachers we carry around with us all the time. This teacher, which tells us so much about life. This teacher that allows us to hear things like the movement of that water, that teaches us so much about life. These teachers, through which we receive the world in the gift of sight. And the gift of this teacher, which tells us something about heat and cold. It tells us something about what we receive in our bodies through the touch of one another, through all that our skin teaches us and tells us about life. There is great wisdom in our senses and great wisdom all around us in creation. And so we find our lives always seeking wisdom. And there are teachers everywhere. I invite us to sing with each other. If there are children with us today that want to make their way to Kids Spirit, you're welcome to make your way to the program in the small hall. And if there are junior high and senior high youth with us today that wish to gather with each other, you're welcome to make your way to the youth lounge downstairs. Share a small parable that comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's Gospel came out of a community that had survived a really significant event in its experience. They had survived the destruction of their temple, a life-changing experience for the way they related to their faith. And so there was this time of great tension between those who were trying to construct what Judaism would be in the face of no temple, and groups like those who had followed the teachings of a prophet like Jesus of Nazareth, who were being expelled from the synagogues that was taking the place of the temple. And there was this struggle between what it meant to be Jewish, what it meant to be a people of the law, after the destruction of their most central institution, the institution of the temple. And a community like Matthew's community draws back into its memory some of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and gathers them up and collects them and organizes them for his community as wisdom for living in the time such as they lived. These words come from Matthew chapter 7. Put into the voice of Jesus. Everyone who pays attention to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise builder who built a house on bedrock. Later, the rains fell, the torrents came, the wind blew and pounded that house, and it didn't collapse because its foundation rested on bedrock. Those who listen to these words of mine and act on them are like such a wise builder. But those who don't act on them are like a careless builder who builds on sand. When the rains fall and the torrents came and the winds blew and pounded the house, it collapsed, and its collapse was colossal. And when Jesus had finished this teaching, the crowds were astonished at his teaching because he taught them as one who had a wisdom and an authority unlike their scholars. This is a parable from the 1st century Jesus tradition. Sing it together. From a wise elder among the poets, Wendell Berry, who's now living in his 82nd year, from his collection of poetry, Work Song Part 2, A Vision. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, if we'll make our seasons welcome here, asking not too much of earth or heaven, then a long time after we are dead, the lives our lives prepare will live here. Their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides, fields and gardens rich in the windows. The river will run clear as we will never know it, and overlook it bird song like a canopy. On the levels of the hills will be green meadows, stockbells in noon shade. On the steppes where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will sing in the fields. In their voices they will hear a music risen out of the ground. They will take nothing from the ground that they will not return, whatever the grief at parting. Memory, native to this valley, will spread over it like a grove. And memory will grow into legend, and legend into song, and song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is not a paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. This is a poem by a wise elder. Part of the genius of wisdom is that it defies definition, and yet it's distinctly recognizable. It's one of those things we all know it when we see it. We all recognize it when we hear it. And you'd think if anyone knows what wisdom is, we should, because after all, we are Homo sapiens. We are the animal that walks upright, carrying that big thinking machine on the top of our bodies with a capacity to communicate fact and fiction, concrete ideas and abstract ideas. We've been arrogant enough about our species to also think that we are the sapiens, we're the wise ones. Or maybe we've confused knowledge with wisdom. Or maybe we've named our potential rather than our actuality. Maybe we are the species that could become wise. And maybe that's why that little story from the Jesus tradition of the first century speaks to me. Just imagine 2 people are out to build themselves a house. One chooses a rocky site to build his house, and the other one chooses a sandy site to build their house. And a huge storm comes, and heavy rains fall, and strong winds blow, and the house that is up on the rock weathers the storm just fine. And the house that was built on sand collapses. The story has always called the successful builder wise. It's hard for us to resist the urge to put a moral on a story. And we want to make it into a syllogism. If this and this, then that. But moralistic endings are anything but trademark for those that we have come to identify as the great wisdom teachers like Lao Tzu and the Buddha and Socrates and Jesus. And we find wisdom in their teachings because we're forced to do some of the work. We're forced to find for ourselves some kind of meaning beyond any trite little truism that just reinforces the status quo. Those ones that we've always recognized as teachers of enduring wisdom never reinforce conventional wisdom. They always challenge it. For teachers of alternative wisdom like Jesus, there's something evocative in their stories, and sometimes something subversive in their stories, something that makes us question our assumptions and challenge our conclusions. Their stories leave us kind of scratching our head and mining them for meaning. For Jesus of Nazareth, the tools of his trade as a teacher were parables like, there's these 2 builders, and one did this and the other did that, and what do you make of all that? Or there's those metaphorical one-liners like his criticism of the religious authorities of the day when he said something like, "You strain out a fly while you're swallowing a camel." And we say, "You make mountains out of molehills. You major in the minors. You live hypocritically, saying one thing and doing another. You miss the point. You don't see the forest for the trees." It's easy for us to hear this story of rock and sand and do what Matthew did with it, Matthew's community. We spin it into a moral. The wise one builds on the rock, and the fool builds on the sand, so put your money on Jesus, and all will be well. But doesn't that just domesticate the story into the kind of simplicity that would blunt the edge of it, which would be trademark for Jesus and any sage? Imagine what wisdom this little story might have held for first century Roman-occupied Palestinian years. For those expansive observant Jews who had seen in Jesus a prophet and a teacher, and now they're being expelled from their synagogues for moving beyond orthodoxy. Couldn't those to whom this story was first being told be hearing that maybe those dominant voices, maybe those cultural norms, maybe that conventional wisdom, maybe that party line, maybe the way things are, isn't as rock solid as it appears? Maybe the Roman Empire, like all empires, will go the way of sandcastles. Here today, gone tomorrow. Maybe the guardians and enforcers and perpetrators of the temple truth and the synagogue teachings don't have the rock, the whole rock, and nothing but the rock. Maybe the cruel selfishness and persecution of their time and ours isn't the house in which tomorrow will live. Maybe it's the house of cards. Maybe our work is to discern a bedrock wisdom on which to build our lives, on which to construct our societies, to shape our spirituality, our science, our technology, our economics, so that we can withstand the inevitable storms that come, if we have the wisdom to survive. Not as individuals, none of us do, but as a species, as a planetary presence. If the poet's right, if we have the wisdom to survive, could it have something to do with discerning what's rock and what's sand? What if you have these two builders and they're both entirely competent and experienced contractors, and they use the same plans, same materials, same suppliers, same subtrades, and the house on the hill stands the test of time, and the house on the beach goes the way of all sandcastles? If we hear this story with postmodern ears, it makes me wonder if the only real difference between these builders is their regard for the context. One of them gives due consideration to the context, and the other fails to accommodate the context, fails to adapt the design to the soil conditions. Surely one can build on sandy soil. We do it all the time. And one can build on rocky soil. But don't we have to do things differently? The one the story calls wise honored the wisdom of creation. He could let rock be rock and sand be sand. It was the builder's job to adapt. It's a wisdom that's not often honored in our contemporary Western thinking. We're quite inclined to ignore the wisdom of the river that knows where it needs to cut its course and will impose its will on our wisdom. As we seek to impose our will on its wisdom, diverting its path to serve our purpose, damming its current to meet our needs, trying to outsmart it with our levees and causeways. But every now and then the rains will come and the floods will come, and we'll be awakened to the wisdom inherent in water that will always seek the lowest level, and the wisdom that's inherent in every element of creation. We can think of countless ways that our smart species builds on sand in disregard for the wisdom of creation. We'll build our highways where animals for centuries have migrated, and we'll lament the number of traffic tragedies. And we'll place our tailing ponds where birds for centuries have migrated, and we'll explain away their deaths on weather forcing them down on our ponds. The list is long. But really, what would it look like to honor the wisdom of creation? We'd likely entrench the rights of air and soil and water and other creatures in some charter or Bill of Rights, the way we've honored the rights of our own species. But in everyday ways of our own lives, what would it look like to honor the wisdom of creation? In our own little garden plots, in our own everyday habits, in our attentiveness to learn from what's around us, in all these small things that are within our power to do. They don't require anything from the big guys or the powers that be, but they do create the potential for a movement of ordinary people doing what's in our power to do, of changing our own habits by honoring the wisdom of habitat, the wisdom of creation. I remember when I first saw those Russian nesting dolls. It was at Expo in 1967. That'll tell you how old I am. As a child, I was intrigued by them. In the writings of Ken Wilber that Bob Hetherington introduced me to, writings that have been picked up by so many others, those Russian nesting dolls have become a symbol for the transmission of evolutionary wisdom. Each successive stage of development, from single cells nesting into molecules, from molecules nesting into atoms, the development from single cell organisms to more complex multi-cell organisms. Every evolutionary stage, each successive stage of development in our unfolding universe has carried the best of its history, the best of its becoming within it. And yet it still keeps expanding outward, tending toward innovation and complexity. Carrying all those successful experiments from the past within it and building something new around it. Each successive stage has a greater nesting capacity than the previous one. Each has the capacity to hold what's come before it, but to enlarge and create new space, more capacity. Could it be that the one we call the wise builder applied what generations before him had learned about rock? But even that's not enough. He had to draw on his own wisdom to adapt his learning to his own particular context, the unique conditions in which he found himself. We're entrusted with a series of nesting dolls, but we're not relieved of the responsibility of building our own. One of the faithful ways to honor wisdom is to discern when rock has become sand, as it will always do. When one nesting doll is complete and it's time to create a new one, when evolutionary wisdom nudges us to adapt, and when it nudges us to innovate, when our context requires creativity, invites us to contribute the evolutionary wisdom of our time and place and expand to build something new. The language and imagery that is rock for one generation will be sand for another. The songs that inspire one generation become sand for another. The ways of understanding the sacred when the world ceases to be flat and the universe is ever expanding may turn rock into sand. Empty pews in so many churches may signal that our spiritual needs are met less and less within the walls of the church and more in relationships we weave in the world. That institutionalized religion that has been a rock for our ancestors may seem to be sand for our children. And we are nudged to begin the work of building a new nesting doll, a new way of shaping community to satisfy our spiritual hungers and thirsts. In a time in which wisdom is an endangered species. Our species, the Homo sapiens, so much depends on us becoming human, becoming wise. Receiving the experience of our elders and the wisdom of creation, integrating our intuition and our knowledge and our experience into the wisdom to survive in the world as it is now, with our planet as it is now, with our cosmos as we know it now, and to become the one Jesus as storyteller imagined as being as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, with our wisdom to do no harm. And doesn't everything under the sun offer us wisdom for our living? we go in the light of all that has gone before us, all that lights the path for us. We go with the wisdom deep within us. We go attuned to the wisdom that is all around us, for there are surely teachers everywhere, in our body, in the wisdom of creation, in each other, in all that is. We go knowing we live in holy mystery, holy wisdom, holy love. And so we sing these words Gail Simonson gave us to sing, words that echo some of the phrases in the United Church of Canada's Song of Faith that was created in about 2005, I think.